this is just the beginning. Hello, and welcome to the Classrooms After COVID-19 virtual event. I'm Kim Hart, National Technology Correspondent at Axios. I'm coming to you from Falls Church, Virginia. Thank you to Siemens for making this conversation possible on the safe return to in-person learning. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course on Axios.com. Please follow along with the hashtag Axios events and at Axios on Twitter. Over the next 30 minutes, I will be joined by my colleague, Erica Pandy. We will unpack what's happening in classrooms across the country and the safety measures being put in place for both students and educators. Our first guest is the chairman of the House Committee on Education and Labor, a member of the House Budget Committee, and the representative from Virginia's 3rd District, Congressman Bobby Scott, joining us from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon, Congressman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
One of your key legislative priorities has been making sure that schools and educators have the resources that they need to reopen safely in the fall. One of those priorities has been improving ventilation in school buildings. Now, that's a challenge across the board when it comes to buildings and making sure that they can improve their infrastructure and these AC systems, but it's especially challenging for schools. Explain why that is.
Well, one of the problems with ventilation is that it's so important. CDC has identified it as an essential element for opening safely. They say you can be at a restaurant outside, but not inside. And that's because if you're inside in a stuffy room, sooner or later, the virus will get all over the room and everybody will be infected. Likewise, in a classroom, if you're in a stuffy classroom without proper ventilation, by the end of the day, everybody's been infected. We need to make sure that these schools have proper ventilation. And regrettably, a GAO report came out last spring that showed that 40% of the school districts in this country need to repair or replace the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems in more than half their schools. So those schools cannot open safely without ventilation. They also need resources for transportation because fewer students on the bus. They need more spend money on PPE and disinfectant and staff to disinfect because the schools won't disinfect themselves. With spacing, there may be fewer students in the classroom, and you need nurses and counselors to properly reopen. But ventilation has been identified particularly because it is so important for safety and because of the deficits in school systems all over the country.
And how are schools going to pay for improving that kind of ventilation? Because that's a very, very expensive upgrade for school systems and buildings as large as some schools are.
Well, one of the things that we've done is provided money for education in the American Rescue Plan. We also had money for education in the previous COVID relief plans, but significant funding in the American Rescue Plan. And they will do with it what they have to do to open safely. Some schools may not have ventilation problems, some may have, and they have to decide what they need to do. The money is being distributed according to essentially according to the Title I formula, so it's going to the areas where it is most needed, and they'll have to make the decisions how to use the money to open the schools safely. There's no debate on whether or not we want the schools open. We know the students do better academically when they are in person. We know they have access to school meals and nutrition. We know that their social and emotional learning can take place when they're interacting with students. It doesn't take place when you're at home looking at a screen. We know that you can identify child abuse and mental health problems if the students are there. So we need to open the schools, and frankly, we're not going to reopen the economy until we reopen the schools. So everybody knows we need to open the schools. The question is whether or not they can be opened safely. And as you pointed out, ventilation is an essential element to that process.
One other thing that you have focused on is making sure that schools have the resources to help students deal with emotional issues and trauma from the pandemic when they do return. And when we're talking about the COVID-19 relief bill recently signed by President Biden, 20% of funds are being earmarked to help schools focus on that. What will schools need to do to help students readjust to life in the classroom after such a tumultuous year?
Well, first of all, they have to open. That's the first challenge. They have to open safely. The next thing we are insisting on is that they spend money to catch up. A lot of these students haven't been in a classroom for a year. A lot have fallen way behind. They need to assess how far behind they've fallen, and we have to have a strategy to catch up. That might mean summer school that hadn't been planned. That might mean smaller class sizes. Might mean a longer class day. Might mean teachers' aides. There are a lot of things that they can do, but we have provided the resources to make sure that the school systems can not only open safely, stay open safely, but also to have the resources to catch up. This is a major investment. It's over $100 billion in resources to schools, targeted where it's most needed. And we expect the school systems to use this money to make up for this year of lost learning.
Do you also expect there to be money made available for infrastructure issues and upgrades for schools in an infrastructure bill that is currently underway and starting to be debated in Congress?
Yes, and in the infrastructure bill that the House passed last year, there was approximately $100 billion for school construction. That is particularly important, as I indicated, to fix ventilation systems, but also to address the fact that the average school in America is more than 40 years old. That's average. That means a lot of them are a lot older than that. They need renovation. A lot of it is just new construction. But the $100 billion will go a long way in making up for this deficit. It won't cure the deficit. Estimates about how much school construction we actually need are in the $200 billion and more range. But the $100 billion will get us well on the way to addressing the deficits in school infrastructure, the school buildings, the internet connections, the ventilation systems, and everything else.
Are there other technological upgrades? You just mentioned broadband, of course, and I know that that's a key priority that has come to the forefront during the pandemic. When we're talking about making sure that schools are ready to open and ready to catch kids up from the slide that they've experienced over the past year, are there other technology tools that you're hoping schools will be able to have access to when they do reopen?
Well, the school, when you have talking about 40-year-old schools, you're talking about a lot of deficits. Not only in ventilation, but also obviously internet connections. In today's education, you're not going to do well if you don't have access to broadband, but also science labs and other things. There are a lot of things that 40-year-old schools do not have that we need. The money spent, the formula in the infrastructure bill that the House passed last year, the Senate didn't pass, was, again, according to the Title I formula, to make sure that the neediest schools got the most money.
And do you have any reservations or doubts that schools will be able to open in person 5 days a week come fall?
Well, one of the challenges we had was that the schools did not have the resources for the ventilation, the extra costs in transportation, PPE, possible smaller class sizes, personnel like nurses and counselors. They did not have the resources. We provided them with the resources, so we certainly hope that they can open safely. It will depend, however, on the Centers for Disease Control guidelines at the time. That will include factors such as whether or not the pandemic is alive and well in the community. If it's at a very low rate, they're much more likely to be able to open than if it's another spike. But that should not be a political decision. It should be a decision based on compliance with the CDC guidelines.
And I know the CDC updated its guidelines recently to make sure that students were maintaining 3 feet of distance rather than 6 feet, which is probably going to help schools be able to open more readily because they won't need quite as much distance between students, and classrooms are more able to accommodate that kind of distance between them. One other question I have.
That is that is also dependent on compliance with other guidelines. That is, not just it's okay to go to 3 feet, but it's okay to go to 3 feet so long as you have masks, disinfectant, and the proper ventilation, and the other things that the CDC has indicated are elements of a safe school environment.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Scott. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And next, we have a View from the Top segment with my colleague, Vice President of Communications at Axios, Yolanda Brignoni.
Thanks, Kim. Now joining us from Arlington, Virginia, President and CEO of Siemens Corporation, Barbara Humpton. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Yolanda. It's great to be with you today.
Thank you so much for being with us for this great conversation. One of the things that people are talking about now is what it will take to help get students and teachers back in the classrooms. Siemens has been on the forefront in this work. I'd love to hear your view on why you think this should be a leading priority in the steps that we're taking to reopen the country.
Well, getting students back into school is absolutely vital. Making sure that we don't leave anybody behind. You know, it's been quite a year with a lot of learning loss and all the stress on parents who have children at home rather than in schools. But thanks to technologies that are available to us today, we have the opportunity to make some changes and to actually make our schools healthier places, to have us be ready for the next issue we're going to face, because this isn't the last crisis we're going to face together. So I'm excited about what we're able to do to deploy technologies that are actually going to be creating a safer environment, a healthier environment, and get us prepared for the future.
And speaking of healthier environments, we're hearing a lot about the importance of good ventilation. Particularly, the CDC has had, that was one of the recommendations. Siemens has some really great ideas about how we can put this into practice. Can you tell us about them and how they can help parents and children be assured that it's safe to go back to the classrooms?
Yeah, happy to. We all know that indoor spaces are a higher risk for our health, especially when we're dealing with a virus as we have been this past year. So when we started looking at this, we really asked the question, how might our indoor environments be transformed actually into a front line of defense? And we reached out into our ecosystem and worked with our partners who are experts in all kinds of technologies that might help us. Boy, we found everything from improving the air quality, air purification, to thermal imaging, to UV lighting, you name it, a whole array of technologies that could go to work to help. One of them is an ozone-free air purification solution that can be installed into existing HVAC systems, and it works by flooding the air with positive and negative ions, really destroying any pathogens that might be there. It's just one example of the kind of technology we can deploy. What we're hearing from early adopters is that it works. In fact, Malloy College in New York was one of the first to implement one of these solutions, and they're now looking forward to in-person classes in the fall.
That's great. This seems to be an area where public-private partnerships can really shine. With the passage of some of the most recent bills, like the American Rescue Plan, funding that's needed for elementary schools, secondary schools, and post-secondary institutions have finally gotten money to really put some of these practices into place. How are companies like yours really getting involved and helping educational leaders take that next step in reopening our schools?
Yeah, given that Congress has actually enacted the ability to deploy over $280 billion to help in addressing exactly these questions and problems, we have this unique opportunity. And I know that school systems are struggling with, hey, how do I go about doing this? So what we've done at Siemens is we've actually empowered teams all across the country on a local level to work with school system administrators, facility managers, et cetera, and to help walk them through the process, to tap into the funds that are readily available to them. I'm happy to say that we're already working with over 150 schools, government buildings, et cetera, deploying these technologies. And my colleagues at Siemens, experts in the area of how to finance these projects, are readily available to help talk people through the process.
That's great. As you well know, a lot of schools were having infrastructure issues and needed upgrades way before COVID. Is this a moment in time that we should be thinking big about the classrooms of the future and not just how to prep the classrooms for COVID right now, but really how can we be preparing for what classrooms might need in the next months, years, or even decades?
Yeah, it's funny, Yolanda. I'm actually a natural optimist. And as we got locked down in COVID, the way my mind went to work was to figure out, well, what do we have? What do we have here at Siemens that can help change the situation we're in? And what I keep finding is that it's in moments like this, right? These moments of intense disruption where we get the opportunity to rethink how we do things. I've been so thrilled to see not only my colleagues at Siemens, but to see our customers and stakeholders like the government really get engaged in asking, if we could build a better future, what would it look like? What do schools need to look like? And we're seeing so many creative ideas come out, everything from more class time outside to, as I say, more things where we can just adapt our built infrastructure. The thing I'm most excited about right now is that in addition to thinking about sustainability, energy efficiency, resilience, reliability of power, all those things that were already on the agenda, we now have also the agenda of healthier buildings moving into the future. So for schools today, for hospitals for sure, but for office buildings and other places where we meet and enjoy working together, enjoy recreating together, we now have the ability to rethink the possibilities ahead of us.
This is great. You all are doing some really important work. Thank you so much, Barbara, for joining us here at Axios.
Yolanda, thank you for the opportunity.
All right. And now to my colleague, Erica Pandy.
Thanks, Yolanda. I'm Erica Pandy. I'm a business reporter here at Axios, and I'm super excited to welcome our final guest, the California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman, who's joining me now from Fremont, California. Good afternoon, Superintendent.
Good afternoon.
So I want to start by asking you, super big picture as someone who's on the ground on this issue. I mean, you think about this all the time, but I think it's important for our viewers to hear it. Why is it important for California's kids and the whole country's kids to get back in the classroom?
Oh, well, there's no question that in-person instruction is the ideal situation for our students to have connection with their teachers and educators, direct connection with peers. And we know that many of our students have had negative experiences and been offset, have had learning gaps that have been exacerbated during the pandemic. And so we're working as hard as we can to help our 1,000 school districts get their schools open for as much in-person instruction as we can provide.
So, we can get in a little bit into the nitty-gritty here because you work on this stuff every day. I mean, we just passed a big COVID relief package here in DC, and there's $130 billion in there for schools. What does that money look like on the ground?
Those resources are so important. It gives access to COVID testing. And even with vaccines, we know that for schools to get open safely and stay open safely, we have to have access to COVID testing. We have to have access to personal protective equipment. We still need people to be wearing masks and social distancing and having the supplies for disinfecting campuses. Those resources also will go to help with what we call resources to accelerate learning, to offset those learning gaps. More tutoring, more summer programs, more after-school programs, the kinds of things that we know will help to accelerate learning and to offset the learning gaps that have been really, really exacerbated during this pandemic.
So another big part of this is ventilation, right? I mean, we've seen that poor ventilation can really rapidly spread COVID. How do you think about HVAC when it comes to returning back to school?
Yeah, it's very important, so much so that this week we are hosting a webinar for all of our school districts on how ventilation can make a difference. And what we've heard from some experts is that just bringing in, fresh air, into classroom spaces makes a huge difference. In our state, we've actually passed legislation for more funds for more ventilation and HVAC programs. We're rolling that out to our schools as grants. And so it's absolutely the case that ventilation and HVAC can make a difference in our fight against COVID.
And when you look across the whole country, right, not every district is thinking about ventilation, not every district is thinking about rapid testing. So when schools really want to think about how to go back, what are the 3 or 4 key things that you think they have to be considering?
We always say we have to follow the science and how schools reopen. It's always been my mantra: follow science and safety. There's certain things that just have to be done. They cannot be relaxed. There has to be social distancing. There has to be the wearing of face masks, and people have to wash their hands. I would say that those are certainly the 3 keys. I, for one, think that COVID testing is a critical piece to the whole puzzle. And from my standpoint, rapid COVID testing is really just everything. There are rapid COVID tests that can give you results within 15 minutes of taking the test. The reason why I think that's so important is because it allows a school leader to have awareness of someone who may be coming to school who may be positive and asymptomatic for COVID. They can be secluded so that you can keep the rest of your school community safe. Our office is working with the governor and others to provide 5 million rapid COVID tests to schools in our state. And we think that it can be a game changer for helping to keep our schools open and keeping everyone safe.
And that's really remarkable. I mean, we've seen colleges that have success stories in reopening. It's been about the testing too. Is it about just testing students who feel sick, or is it about asymptomatic testing and testing everyone regularly? What's the better approach in your opinion?
Yeah. Obviously, we do all those things. And if someone does show signs, that's important information, and we can allow someone to get, a PCR test. But everyone has talked about how these antigen tests, these rapid COVID tests, give you a kind of awareness, a kind of surveillance to know what you're coming back to. Even if it's just once a week, it can make a critical difference. For many of our schools that are now bringing sports back, they're using these rapid COVID tests. It gives them the ability to bring our athletes back. We know how important extracurriculars are for our students. And so I would just say that rapid COVID test is part of the equation. Obviously, having vaccines is a game changer. In our state, more than 400,000 educators have already been able to receive the vaccine. And we're going to keep working until we help all of our 40 million Californians receive the vaccine.
That was going to be my next question. That's such an important piece. I mean, kids are obviously a huge part of this, but so are teachers. And teachers are really worried right now. I mean, all over the country. How are you speaking to your public school teachers and making sure they know that their voices are being heard and their concerns are being addressed?
Our teachers have worked really hard, and, let's face it, education wasn't meant to be delivered in a remote kind of fashion. And so this has been difficult on everyone. We have found that many students in our state, like most states, don't have access to high-speed internet. And so I've started an innovation challenge to say that we want to get innovators, researchers, and others who can help us come up with a way to bridge the gap until we can expand broadband in our state. We've got parts in our state that don't have access to the infrastructure to even transmit broadband. And so we are working to close that gap. We're offering $1 million cash prize to innovators, researchers, entrepreneurs who help us come up with a bridge solution while we're building that infrastructure for broadband. But in the meantime, our teachers have worked hard in distance learning. It's a difficult thing. It's not the way our system was meant to deliver education. We've moved into that system almost overnight. And we're seeing many of the impacts and the effects of it. And so vaccines are very important. We're getting to a place where most of the educators in our state have had access to the vaccine, at least the first vaccine. We want to keep working until they've gotten access to 2. So we think this is a very important step until we can get to a place where students are able to have the vaccine and we can reach a kind of herd immunity. There are projections that that's, not for a while for us until maybe May or so. Until then, we're really working to accelerate those who can get access to it. We also know that there are those who are just concerned about underlying health conditions. And we see communities in our state where parents have been surveyed, and some have said, even with vaccines and rapid COVID tests, that they're going to wait and not come back right away. But the way we've set things up in California, we've created a pathway that our schools can reopen for in-person instruction, even if families are asking to continue to remain in remote learning.
And, you mentioned obviously in-person instruction is superior, educators agree on that. But we have seen a lot of innovation from students and parents and especially teachers in this time. Are there any lessons from this, any tech lessons that you plan to take into the future, even if we don't have, kids at home, we have them in the classroom?
Well, I actually believe that we're going to see a lot of people continuing to use a form of distance learning even after most of our classes have returned for in-person instruction. But if you provide the right training, I think the key is you got to provide training. You have to make sure everyone has access to devices and high-speed internet. There has to be digital literacy training for students and their families and for educators. These are important tools that can still be used. They just can't replace an educator. Nothing replaces having a teacher at the head of the class who works with our students. But this experience has told us that we can use distance learning in a way that can be helpful for our students. And so again, with the right training and supports, this can be an important part of how we educate. The pandemic is forcing us to think differently about how we measure learning. From my standpoint, we're going to have to look past just high stakes testing as the way to measure learning. We need to really think about what teachers do to assess learning in real time, to make adjustments to help students who get back on grade level. And using tools like distance learning can be part of the playbook for how we continue our efforts to close the gap. But I, for one, think that there's nothing more important than having a teacher making connection directly with their students.
And then with just under a minute left, I want to address the question of equity. Not all districts have the same amount of money. How are you distributing funds to make sure every district has a shot at doing this well and safely, the return?
Our state has provided, billions literally for our school districts. We use a formula that really prioritizes those districts that serve more low-income students, homeless students, foster youth, and students of color. We recognize that there have been gaps. Our state's also doing the same thing to prioritize where vaccines go and where rapid COVID testing goes, so that there's an equity lens. For those who have trouble accessing health resources, we have mobile clinics and we have ways to prioritize their needs. Our office has even given grants to school districts to do what we call equity grants, to do more family engagement and connection with families of English learners, African-American students, Latino students, and others who historically have been impacted by the so-called achievement gap, or the opportunity gap, as I call it. We've been providing more resources to these districts so they can have more connection. We're continuing to address these issues through an equity lens. We know that race and bias have historically played a factor. And so we're providing resources to our school districts to do implicit bias training so that we can make sure that we're providing the best for all of our students throughout the state.
Super illuminating. Thank you so much for your time, Superintendent Thurmond.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining us for another lunchtime conversation that made us all smarter, faster. I want to thank Siemens, our sponsor, for making today's conversation possible. And for more information or to sign up for one of Axios' newsletters, visit axios.com/newsletters or visit us on the Axios app. We'll see you all back here soon. Thanks.